Does reinforcement-based dog training actually work in the real world? Can you be successful at the elite level of all dog sports? Or is using a tool or tactic that might be described as balanced or a level of correction actually a more effective way to train your dogs? Well, I'm going to be talking through my journey into reinforcement-based dog training in today's podcast. If you want to listen in, join me for today's podcast on lifting all ships. Hi there everybody, it's Kamal Fernandez here from Lifting All Ships with today's podcast answering the question, does reinforcement-based dog training actually work in the real world? And there is this ongoing discussion about the effectiveness of positive training or force-free training or whatever you want to call it, and whether it actually works. So I thought I would share with you my journey into dog training and to give you my experience and my hands-on practical journey into the world of positive or reinforcement-based dog training. So there is an ongoing, discussion, argument, war, if you want to call it, in some fields or some conversations between those of us that choose to use reinforcement to train dogs and people that use reinforcement but also use either tools or equipment or corrections to train their dogs. And you can go in either end of the extremes of those discussions. I choose not to have a label that I attach to myself when I train dogs. I suppose that's because I think labels limit us. But I'm a trainer that uses reinforcement. And, you know, am I implicitly a reinforcement-based dog trainer? I will leave that up to you to decide for yourself based on the information I'm going to give you today. As I said, I don't get into, camps, and it's not my thing. I think that the world that I live in, I like what I do, I'm comfortable with what I do, and it's taken a moment to get to this position. So, if I went back to when I first started training dogs, which was over 30 years ago now, most people use an element of force or compulsion when they train their dogs. And there was sporadically a couple of people that chose to use minimal corrections. And there was certainly a couple of people in the dog training world that were making a shift towards using more reinforcement or positive methods. So my own personal experience was I was a young kid. I got my first dog. I went to the local dog training class, which was very much based on the Kohler approach to dog training, where on the first night I was talked through how to fit a check chain on the dog and shown how to, by first putting it on my wrist, showing how it worked, and then putting that on my dog. So I was taught how to fit the tool onto my dog. Whether she needed it or not was never a discussion or an evaluation being done. But that was my first experience into dog training and using a tool that would be an aversive tool for the process of training my dog. And, I was so green. I was 9 years old. My parents knew nothing about dog training. They knew nothing about dogs. We didn't really know much about dogs either at all. And we were largely governed or directed by the person that we saw as the expert on dogs and dogs training and dog behaviour, and that was the trainer at the time. And he was, I have to say, a really, really lovely person, and he really embraced me as an individual. So with Scrunch, that was the dog at the time, we definitely used compulsion. I think that was common practice in those days. Everybody turned up and they were taught how to put a check chain on their dog, and the methodology was somewhat more how should I say this? I suppose just different. In that the first night we went training, or after we had learned how to fit my check chain or the check chain, we started our lesson straight away, and it was very much about walking around the hall and turning 90 degrees after a certain distance. and if the dog went forward, which obviously it would, you turned and you checked the dog and you loosened and you walked again. You repeated that process. So the dog really learned to avoid a level of discomfort and possibly pain, who knows, in order to, what was the lesson we were trying to teach was loose lead walking. Sit was very much taught with compulsion, so you pulled up on the check chain and you smacked the dog's bum, basically, was how you taught sit. We weren't allowed to use food, we weren't allowed to use toys. Your reinforcement was praise the dog. So you would do, several minutes work, and then at the end it would be, and release your dogs and really praise them. That was what our dogs were taught to work for. And obviously now, in hindsight, I can see the infinite amount of flaws in that approach to training. And certainly for pet dog training, I would say that was really, really ineffective because, science tells us that the dogs weren't being reinforced sufficiently. The information probably wasn't really clear, even with the use of aversives, because aversive tools can be used in an operant manner and can be used scientifically, as it were. Punishment, by definition, is part of the quadrant. So we it's not to say that it's about good or bad or right or wrong per se. It's about the technique and the tools, and certainly at that time, it was ineffective. If I look back on my own personal journey and my own personal experience, I was 9 years old. I knew nothing about dog training. I knew nothing about dog behaviour. And whilst I always had a level of natural timing, I still didn't know really what I was doing. So you're putting, effectively a tool that could inflict pain or discomfort on the dog without sufficient education, sufficient knowledge, the ability to read a dog and know what I was doing, and I was just told, to do X, Y, and Z. So, is the method effective? It certainly wasn't effective for my dog, and the reason I say that is because it was probably down to my lack of knowledge and experience and so forth. So, if we think of the dynamic of putting an inexperienced dog owner and an inexperienced dog trainer with a tool that could inflict a level of discomfort and pain on the dog, we really have to ask ourselves, is that morally and ethically fair on the dog? And at that point was where I very quickly switched on to a martingale collar or a half check, because one, because she was a coated dog. Two, because it was probably, to be fair, I probably stuck with the check chain for a period of time. The initial check chain that I actually had broke because it was just one I made shift one. That I had a bit of chain attached to key rings, and then, as you can imagine, it burst. So they gave me a proper check chain. She had that for a period of time, and then we progressed to a martingale or a half check because she was a little bit more, receptive to training. Probably actually receptive to the punisher or the pain, if I'm being honest. But then I found out about the world of dog sports, and in dog sports, even in that time, the emphasis was about motivation, but it was primarily about using a toy as a motivator. Again, I would say at that time, whilst food was used in various places, it wasn't the prevalent methodology in a lot of schools of thought. I don't know why that is. I think that was, as I said, it was definitely, I think it was largely because, if this is anecdotal, the dogs that we had at the time, primarily sports-bred border collies, were receptive to that approach. They were receptive to a toy, and they were receptive to the ball, and manipulating them with the ball. So it was easy to transition them into various sports behaviours by the use of the ball or the toy or the tug toy, etc. So, but even at that point, even when I started doing sports training, I was probably what you would describe as a balance trainer. So I would physically manipulate my dogs would physically manipulate them to do what I wanted them to, either guiding them with an element of lead pressure. So you could say, using a level of force. And whilst there was a lot of emphasis on lead technique, and the parallel in the background to that would have been horse riding and using reins. So the emphasis at that time was really about using the lead as a tool and guiding the dog. And the it was very much about lead technique. We would pop the lead or check the lead, and we would do some conditioning to build up the dog's tolerance. There were several different, approaches to how you would use the lead and the etc. So, and a lot of sports dog trainers still used half checks and check chains, quite fine check chains, positioned quite high up around the dog's neck. But they would do some conditioning with it. So they would condition the dog to tolerate or endure the check. So they'd check the dog and reinforce the dog, check the dog, pair it with reinforcement. So the dog would develop a level of tolerance to that tool. So looking at it without emotion, and I look back, and obviously now I would probably feel, uncomfortable with some things that we did. It was a learning curve for somebody that was new to the world of dog training. And I would say at the time, that was the prevalent thought. And we believed what we did was effective, and that we were reinforced for that behaviour, because there was a huge array of dogs that were trained in that approach that were incredibly successful. All of probably a distinct type, high drive border collies or sports bred border collies, who were receptive and amenable to training anyway. And every now and again you'd get another breed, a golden retriever, German shepherd, or something a bit unusual that would slip through the net, that was sort of a little bit of a cuckoo in the nest, so to speak. They were the odd one out, but they would be receptive to those methods. And at the time, we genuinely didn't believe that we were being harsh, unfair, etc. to our dogs. We thought, because we were using motivators, that we were being positive in our training. There was a lot of emphasis on play training, using play as a medium to train, which is, to be honest, is what I still do now. And we definitely use the level of force. So we would teach the dogs and manually manipulate them. We would physically guide them with our hands. So we would obviously do some conditioning to get the dog accepting our hands. I like to be quite physical even now with my dogs, so that I have definitely retained from my past. And I do a lot of conditioning to get my dogs comfortable with handling. Obviously now in today's definition or today's world, we'd call that husbandry or counter conditioning with handling, which for me is a massive part of domestic dog training. And it's a huge thing that I do with all my dogs, to get them to trust my hands and to be comfortable with my hands. I do it differently now to what I did in the past, but there was still conditioning taking place. Further to that, we obviously taught the dog to want and build desire for the toy, which is something, again, I still do to this day. But we definitely used force, and we would manipulate the dog physically, and if the dog was shown it didn't do it, we would then use a level of force, whether it be physical force, lead, pressure, a correction verbally, a physical correction, grabbing the dog, telling him not to do something. Change of voice was another way in which we would correct our dogs, changing the tone. There was a lot of things that we would do, which at the time we believed was effective, and the dogs reinforced our behaviour because they were successful. My first obedience dog was trained primarily with that approach, and he was an obedience champion. So it reinforced that thinking, and I didn't for 1 minute think I was, being cruel or unfair or horrible to my dog. And he loved to work. He enjoyed the process of interacting with me. And because the information was broken down, which we did, we definitely didn't do lumping. We broke it down to pieces, or certainly I did. And it wasn't necessarily, we didn't do any shaping, we didn't use any platforms, anything along those lines. We did use props and physical barriers, etc., for our dogs to teach them to, sit straight and run straight. So it's ironic that we do a lot of that in today's version, or my version of training now. But there was a lot of things that we did that was definitely beneficial to our dogs, and there was a lot of things that now I look back in hindsight and I realise there was more efficient ways of training. We definitely didn't encourage our dogs to necessarily think for themselves. It was very much about us showing them, teaching them. There wasn't that want for them to be independent in their thinking or to figure things out per se. So I would say that at the time, as I said, I was probably what you would describe as a balanced trainer. I would use primarily reinforcement or play and motivation with layers of compulsion. I never used with my own dogs anything like pinch collars, electric collars, or check chains post that first dog. So after Scrunch, none of my other dogs have ever had a check chain on them to train them. dogs that I've done sports with. So Punch, my boxer, by the rules of regulations of IGP, it means that they have to have one on for competition. So he had to wear one for that purpose, and obviously I conditioned him to accept it. But it wasn't something I would use to train my dogs. So then I stumbled along the world of clicker training, and my personal experience came from studying it at college. And I was doing psychology as part of my studying at my A-levels, and they were talking about operant conditioning, classical conditioning, behaviorism, and the whole, the science of training and how we learn, and animals learn, and organisms learn, and human beings learn, and dogs learn, and etc., etc. And it really got me thinking about this stuff that I was learning, and it was very it got me thinking about the stuff that I was learning in education or in formal education versus what I was doing in training my dogs. And I was at a bit of a crossroads, knowing that I knew I wanted to change the way in which I trained, and it was really down to the dogs that I owned. So at the time, there was clicker training was becoming more popular and more prominent. So Karen Pryor had started to have released a Don't Shoot the Dog, and that was a book that was absolutely, like a forest fire through the dog training and animal training world, and really, really, it's the beacon with which a lot of us look to when we train dogs with this method, and it was so pioneering. I read it. Again, it made me really think about my own training and look at things, and I was intrigued by it. And then obviously another part of my life, studying, I was like absorbing this information from an academic point of view, and I started to think about the possibility of clicker training. And there was a particular person who had the courage to start clicker training with her dog. So in obedience at that time, there was a couple of people dabbling with clicker training. Obedience is a sport I primarily partake in, and they were being more vocal about what they were doing. So the first person was a lady called Joanna Hill, and she really, I think she got clicker training from another source, and I'm not particularly sure where she originally got it from, but she was the first person that started to be quite vocal about clicker training. And I think at the time Kay Lawrence was also being more vocal about clicker training and its value. Neither of them, I don't think, were competing at the time. Kay definitely wasn't. I don't know, I can't remember the timeline. Joe might have been with a couple of dogs. But they were definitely, the thing that came across was their dogs would do particular singular behaviours or individual behaviours really, really well, but they definitely lacked consistency, and they weren't winning at the top level. So there was a bit of cynicism about the power of the methodology. And I think that would be a collective opinion. Now, that's great for trick stuff, but does it actually cut the mustard when it comes to real competition? And there was a couple of people that decided to really run with it, and I believe they trained with Joe or had some influence from Joe. And the first one that was definitely uber successful was a lady called Kathy Murphy, who's now moved to Canada. She was a British dog trainer, and she had a black German Shepherd called Denzel, and this was, I think it's probably 25 years ago now, 20 plus years ago. And she had a black German Shepherd, and she was very open about the fact that she was clicker training him. And I would say probably she was what you would call primarily a clicker trainer. I think domestically she was probably a more balanced trainer, but definitely in her sports training she was a positive reinforcement based dog trainer or a reinforcement based dog trainer. And she produced this incredible dog who went flying up through the classes at a relatively young age, and her and I, we were competing at a similar time, so we were sort of at the classes together, and her dog was always the one that we would be in the same class, and we would be competing against each other at each level. And she went flying through the classes, which wasn't unusual for dogs in general, but was unusual for the breed. He was a German Shepherd, which, they're slow maturing, and if I recall, he got to the elite level of our sport, he might have been 2 years old, which is exceptional for any dog, but in particular a German Shepherd. So Kathy was very, very. His name was Denzel, and she qualified him for Crufts. I think we both qualified the same year for the first time. Might have been 2000, which is 20 plus years ago, and she really made me sit up and think about the possibility of clicker training for sports. And at that point, there had been people that had crossed over, so had trained dogs and then used a clicker, but she really was the first person, if I recall rightly, that had a dog that was purely clicker trained, that had succeeded at the elite level of dog sports. And he became a champion, and unfortunately he had a back injury, had to be retired relatively young, and Kathy moved from England to abroad, and there was a lot of changes in her life. So who knows what he could have achieved, but he was a phenomenon, I'd say, at that time. And then it sort of had a snowball effect in the sport. And then there was a couple of other people that really took up that mantle. Suzanne Jaffa and Anne Bussey, they were, again, two clicker trainers who had, Anne had a Border Collie. She won the Kennel Club Working Trials Championship with a clicker trained Border Collie. And Suzanne had two Australian Shepherds, which were often assumed to be stubborn and difficult, and she made one an obedience champion and one a work and trials champion, and that was again a phenomenal achievement, the first in their breed to do so, that were clicker trained, and that really made people sit up and think about the possibilities of clicker training, and it certainly inspired me. So at the time I had my Border Collie Springer, and I attempted to clicker train him, if I'm being truthful, I put my hands up now and did a really bad job of it, and I didn't understand the application of the method effectively. And I played around with certain things with the clicker training, and I didn't understand how it all fell into piece. And I largely used a clicker and I used more reinforcement, but I went back to being a more balanced trainer with that dog. And he got to the championship level in obedience. But I always felt, and whilst I had used clicker training throughout his career, I always felt that it was like that dogged part of me, or the pig-headed part of me, wanted to train a dog using a clicker. So when I got my first Malinois strut, I was absolutely committed to, right, I'm going to clicker train this dog, kill or cure, as it were. And I was absolutely determined to clicker train him, which I did. And he got to, again, the top level of obedience. And he was a dog that, obviously he's a Malinois, the first Malinois I ever owned. Incredibly powerful dog, incredibly strong dog. And I made a lot of mistakes with him in various things, but I had a lot of success with him. He was, as I said, my first dog that I really, really clicker trained, purely. And then each dog I had, my understanding got better and better and better. And I started to then look to other sources for information, and to expand my knowledge about clicker training and applying it to dog sports specifically. Now, at that time, I was still using force and with my dogs, or you would say I was a balanced trainer domestically, not using tools. That's not something that's been an option for me. But I would use an element of correction of domestically. And so domestically, I would use a level of correction, but in my sports training, I would clicker train them. And then I sort of, as I said, my training and my journey evolved until I thought, you know what, I think that I can do this without using force or compulsion or any corrections totally in my training, which I did, again, with the first dog that I did it with was a Border Collie called Hustle and a German Shepherd called Swag. Unfortunately, both those dogs died relatively young. I lost them relatively young. But their whole life they were trained using clicker training, and domestically they were as well. So I felt, although they were two dogs and I only had them for a relatively short period of time, I knew that it was possible. So they were the dogs that really sparked me that cemented my belief in reinforcement-based training. And the fact that I lost them so young actually affirmed that to me, because the circumstances of me losing them, which I will share with you in a different podcast, it really affirmed to me in the last days that I had with them, it sat well with me that they hadn't experienced anything that I would then subsequently regret. Whether it be, my poor training, my mistiming, my frustration, I could look myself in the mirror and knew that I hadn't done anything that I would regret with those particular dogs. And, you know, the circumstances of losing them was one of those things. It's unfortunate, but it was definitely a blessing that they had been trained in a certain way, and it really sat well with me. So it was allowed me to make peace with that. So each dog I had subsequently after those, I immersed myself further and further in the world of reinforcement-based dog training. And then obviously in my career professionally, I started to teach people. I was teaching people and using a balanced approach. You would say, and my students were successful, competing in various dog sports. But that would have been tried and tested. I knew I could do that. And then I started to accrue people that really wanted to embrace this concept of reinforcement-based dog training entirely. And then I started to, teach more and more people using these principles and methods. And it really astounded me what was possible and what they could achieve from, dogs that would previously, even I would have probably said this is going to be a really challenging dog. Actually, with the power of clicker training and reinforcement-based dog training, how effective it was. And that just snowballed. And then obviously I got asked to teach abroad and share that information, and from that it's been like a ripple effect. Now I would say that there's so many people out there that are using reinforcement based dog training to train dogs, not only for domestic dog training, for sports dog training, that are succeeding at the elite level of dog sports. And I would say all the dog sports now, probably the exception being Mondio and PSA. Those are the ones I'd say, but I would say there has been a elite level competitor, or the championship level competitor in every dog sport. Probably field trials, maybe not yet. Mondio and PSA, they probably haven't those. But if I'm honest, I think it's just a matter of time. And it's not to say that alternative approaches will die out or will stop. I think that more people will realise it's achievable. And I equate this to the 4-minute mile. For a longest time, people believed that it wasn't possible to run a mile within 4 minutes until one person did it, and then everybody believed it was possible. And I think it was a mental block rather than anything else. We now have the information. We now have a pool of minds thinking and together and working together, consciously or subconsciously, literally or via social media, to that are pushing that ball forward further and further. And my belief is that it's only a matter of time before all sports have several people competing successfully at the top level using reinforcement-based dog training. And they're going to be on par at the same level as those that are training more traditionally or using alternative methods. This conversation really isn't about beating up people that have opposing viewpoints from me. It's just saying there's another option that's available to people. As a trainer, as an individual, I try not to point the finger and judge people for how they choose to train with their dogs, because we're all on our own journey. And I know from my own personal experience, I at one point didn't believe what I did was wrong or inappropriate or incorrect, or I genuinely believe that it was the right approach to my dogs at the various stages of my training, whether it be Scrunch with my domestic dog training, walking in that hall, to Ty, my first obedience dog, who was largely trained using a balanced approach, to the dogs that I have now that largely are trained with, that are trained with using reinforcement and understanding that reinforcement is all around them, but also living under the mantra of positive is not permissive. So, I think that's the misconception that a lot of people have, that, well, what do I do if it goes wrong? What do I do if my dog says it doesn't want to pick up the retrieve article, or it doesn't want to stop, or it doesn't want to release? We now have an answer to those questions. And those answers are easily available due really to the power of social media. You have Denise Fenzi, you have Susan Garrett, you have Janice Gunn, you have myself, all being really vocal and open about what is possible through using reinforcement-based dog training to achieve incredible results from domestic dog training, whether it's calling your dog off sheep or livestock, to competing at the World Championships in a dog sport. All of that is attainable, all of that is achievable under the banner of reinforcement-based dog training. Now, the counter-argument is there probably is more people that have been successful using alternative methods, but if we look at the timeline of when reinforcement-based dog training has been accessible and been the prevalent thinking, it's relatively smaller and shorter than the history that we have in dog training of using a balanced approach or using aversives or punishment or corrective tools with our dogs. That was the common practice for the longest period of time. If we look at the history of dog training, we would see that using correction, using punishment, using check chains or tools was the most prevalent and prominent approach to training dogs for the longest time. So the data is going to be there to support the argument that those methods are effective. I would say now that we've embraced reinforcement-based dog training as an option in a lot of dog training circles and dog training sports, it's just a case of time for all those for the data to be collated and there be sufficient people to contend with what has been done in the past. The arguments that we have online about the pros and cons about scenarios of saving a dog's life, or the dog in this situation, it's then justified to use X, Y, and Z. For me, those arguments are largely going to become less and less relevant as we know more. The advances in dog training that I've seen in the last 20 years, 25 years, 30 years has been exponential. It's been absolutely amazing to see the journey of dog training as a collective and how far we have come. And it inspires me to think how far we have to go. For me, that's what excites me. It keeps my interest. And I urge people to just think about whether there's things they want to look at within their own training and consider a different approach. It's not about it being better or good or bad or worse, just trying different things, because that keeps our interest. For me, I've been doing this for a long time. I love to learn new things. I love to see if there's a better way in which I communicate with my dogs. I love to see if there's a better way in which I can teach my students. I love to see if there's a better way to get a better, more efficient result. And there's a better way to be successful, which is our ultimate goal. So just think it over. For me, it's not about drawing lines and arguing with people. It's about offering possibility. And I hope that's what this podcast does for you. Thank you for listening to my musings about dog training and my own personal journey from being a traditional dog trainer to one that embraces the concept of reinforcement-based dog training. If you like this podcast, click like and subscribe to make sure that you get notified whenever there's any new podcast coming out. For now, enjoy your dogs and enjoy whatever it is that you do.